Now, we looked in the second week at impediments to our attempts to change that were external to us. In other words, in social groups or in people who, despite what they may say, don't actually want us to change. So when we make those efforts to change, they actually put roadblocks in the way for us. So we looked at methods we can use to try and create connections with those people so that they don't end up throwing roadblocks. Then last week, we switched from people outside of us to our own selves, because obviously if we're going to move towards wholeness, we're the ones who are going to have to do the moving. We're the ones who have to change. And so that involves our whole person. And we looked at one perspective on that. This was by the medical psychiatrist Gerald May, and his book, Grace and Addiction and Grace. And what he ended up saying, you remember, was all of us are addicts in every sense of the word. And when we become addicted to some object of addiction, we get stuck. We get enslaved to this object, and we do not have the wherewithal within us to break free of it. In other words, our hope comes in God, from God. God is the one who has to show us how to get out of that prison that we've developed. Okay. In particular, you remember that he said that neither the will nor the mind are going to be any, much help for this situation. The mind is no help because apparently 100% of it wants to keep the object of addiction. But the will is no help because it's split into two parts. A part that wants to be free of the addiction, but another part that likes the addiction, wants to keep it. And so what we learned is there's simply not enough of us, including in the will, to break free of that object of addiction. So that's where we left last week. And in just a minute, we're going to pick up with a very different perspective, but I wanted to stop, see if there were any comments or questions from last week or from what we've done so far. And you remember that last week I said that whenever I teach in churches or the classroom on Gerald May's book, people start thinking about their own addictions. But let me see if do you have any comments or questions based on what we've done so far?
All right, friends, just remember to keep the noise level down and make sure everybody gets a chance. You can raise your hand. You can find that little icon on there. Or if for whatever reason you can't figure that out, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. I've got the gallery view up. I'm not seeing any.
Ask if you.
Oh, Alan Dunham. I'm sorry, Alan.
I think that everything that you've mentioned in your classes so far, I can relate to. This is my Tao right here, sitting next to me.
Many people, including myself, I mean, that sounds like a huge struggle, what you talked about last week. And you have to really, really, really want it, right? Mm-hmm. To go through that. How many people really, 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 really want it?
No, that's a great question, and it actually gets into what we're looking at, which is a straightforward answer to the question, how many people really want it. Let's just take the question we're looking at in this 6-week series, right? The path towards wholeness. And we could ask, how many people really, really want to become whole persons? And a straightforward, rational or linear answer to the question would say everybody. Who doesn't want to be whole, right? And sure enough, many of the books that you find in Barnes and Noble under the self-help section have the same straightforward rational answer. Well, of course we want to be better. We want to be whole. We want to be healthy, right? So there's that answer. However, Christianity tends towards a more complex answer. And what it tends to say is, and this reflects Gerald May, part of us wants to be whole, and part of us doesn't actually want to be whole, right? So we're conflicted, right? Part of us wants things to be better. Part of us doesn't, really want it to be better. And the reason for no, I don't actually want this, even though it sounds like it's the best, is normally it has to do with fear or just the sheer exhaustion of thinking about all the energy. I mean, even in your question yourself, you said, wow, that sounds really, really hard. And the fact is, it is really, really hard, right? Gerald May makes it clear, hard to break an addiction. And so some people, they're afraid of trying and failing. Other people, believe it or not, are afraid of trying and succeeding. See, this is where it gets complicated. And what I mean is, think about that second class session we had with Harriet Lerner, right? When you start to try and make a change, and then everyone in your family or your work group starts giving you negative feedback because they don't want you to change, what you may realize is that if you succeed in changing, it may come at a cost, right? You might actually alienate family, friends, co-workers, people who didn't want you to do the change. You made the change, you succeeded. Now they're not happy with you. So those are the kinds of things that may make a more complex answer to, well, do we want to be whole? I don't know if you remember, I think I mentioned this last week, but Jesus had to ask the question when he came, for example, to the person the lame person who had been sitting by one of the pools in Jerusalem, the healing pools. It might have been Bethsaida, but person supposedly they can't get into the pool in time to get healed. Jesus walks up and says to this person, do you want to get healed? And the person is incredulous. What do you mean, do I want to get healed? I come here every day. I've been here for 15 years. And Jesus nevertheless looks him in the eye and asks him the question. That's Jesus' perspective on human nature. We're complicated.
Great. Any other questions, comments for Greg? And I don't think I'm seeing any more, Greg.
Okay. All right, so we're going to make a transition into today's perspective. And what you're going to notice is today's perspective is wildly different than last week's perspective. It's quite far from Gerald May, right? Although you remember, both these people are scientists, right? So that's what makes this interesting. But what we're taking a look at is the argument in a book called Willpower by Roy Baumeister. And he's a psychologist who does research science on human behavior. And what's interesting about Baumeister is that he started out his career in the 70s and 80s, interested in what was called back then the self-esteem movement. I don't know if you remember this, but this was, psychologists discovered that if you had a pretty good positive sense of yourself, you tended to be pretty successful in life. So they simply put the two together and said, well, if we want to help people more successful, we need to build up their self-esteem. So you spend a lot of effort trying to tell people that they were wonderful and good and talented and all this, with the hope that they'd actually perform well. So that's where this guy started. It's not anywhere near willpower. But this is where this whole question of willpower began. It began with, again, is a Stanford psychologist who did something that's become known as the marshmallow experiment. And he did it with 4-year-olds. And so what he was interested in was, how does a child learn to resist immediate gratification? In other words, when and how does a child learn to delay gratification? That was the purpose of the marshmallow experiment. And what they did is they put 4-year-olds in a room, and the scientists walked in and said, here, if you can, here's this marshmallow, okay? And I'm going to put it on the table. But if you can wait, 10 minutes or so, you'll get a second marshmallow. And then the person walked out of the room. And they had cameras on the children, and they watched and recorded, which ones ate the marshmallows and which ones waited and got 2 marshmallows. Right? And so they're trying, that was the gist of the experiment. But what happened was, years later, the scientist, Walter Mischel, his daughter, reported in middle school, hey, this kid, he's way out of control. He cannot seem to control himself, and he's a big trouble in the classroom. And Walter remembered that name as one of the 4-year-olds. And that perked his interest, and he said, I wonder how those 4-year-olds are doing now that they're in middle school. So his team did research and found all those kids and basically asked them, how are you doing in life? And what they found was, the small number of children who were able to wait for that second marshmallow had better grades, better test scores, were more popular, earned higher salaries when they got into adulthood, had a lower body mass index, were less likely to abuse drugs, right? And they continued to follow these kids into college and adulthood. And the only trait that enabled them to predict reliably this kid's going to succeed was willpower, period. Self-control, right? Self-control is better than knowing a student's IQ or SAT scores in predicting if they succeed or not. In other words, would they show up reliably for class? Would they start their homework earlier? Would they spend more time working and less time watching TV? Those were the questions that mattered in terms of predicting success. So they realized, wow, whatever self-control is, which is another word for willpower, it is enormous in helping a human being succeed. Okay? How that relates to our question is, we're supposedly wanting to go on a journey from being not whole to whole. Well, that journey is going to take self-control. It's going to take willpower. Okay? So willpower is important. Now, here's the other thing that they've learned, neuroscientists, is humans are unique in that they developed a large prefrontal cortex. It's the latest part of the brain in terms of evolutionary development. So we've got big brains. Those big brains require a lot of energy, right? They suck up energy, right? For example, the human brain makes up only 2% of the human body, but it consumes 20% of the body's energy, right? It takes a lot of energy. All right, so they began to ask, well, why did we even develop a prefrontal cortex, right? The most advanced part of the brain. And the theory was, well, we needed it for language or, problem solving or using tools. But one of the theories that these people have is we needed it for self-control. Because, so that's why the brain expanded. Because when humans went into larger and larger social groups, the junior members of the society needed to control their impulses if they weren't going to get kicked out by the leaders in the group, right? So in other words, if it's food time and the leader is eating, you don't want to be the junior member who says, hey, give me some of that, right? You may feel that way, you may want it, but don't say it. You got to keep your mouth shut, and that takes self-control. So that's the theory that suggests why we have such a big brain and how the brain is related to the growth in willpower. All right, so then they did another study. This study is called the radish and warm cookie experiment. Radishes, warm cookies, and it was done with college students. So what they did is they invited college students, 3 different groups, into a room. And one group was invited to eat warm cookies while they were waiting. The second group was invited to eat radishes even though there was warm cookies on the table. They couldn't eat the cookies, but they could eat the radishes. The third group, there's no food at all on the table. Okay, they're just waiting. So 3 groups. Then after roughly 15 minutes, they're invited to do a geometry puzzle for which there's no solution, right? It's actually a puzzle that you can't solve. So it's just meant to show how long you're willing to beat your head against a wall. Here's what they discovered, right? In terms of discovering who's got perseverance. Well, those who were allowed to eat warm cookies lasted 20 minutes. Those who had no food at all offered to them lasted 20 minutes. Those who were allowed to eat radishes but no cookies lasted 8 minutes. So in other words, all of the energy to maintain the self-control not to eat the warm cookies used up energy that the willpower needed. So the energy going into willpower was decreased and they had less willpower. Okay, what this taught these scientists was that willpower, it's not a metaphor for a spiritual non-entity. It's rather it's about something in the body that's like a muscle, and the muscle needs energy to work. And that muscle with the willpower fluctuates during the day. Sometimes it's at its peak, other times it is weak, up and down, right? Okay. They also found this with a marriage counselor. The marriage counselor was just exhausted working with these. He primarily worked with 2 career couples. So these people would come home, they'd fight all evening long. Just, So then he had this, he was desperate. So he came up with this idea. He told these couples, go home from work early. And they're like, what? Then we're just going to fight more. They went home from work early and they stopped fighting. They were nice to each other. They were able to be, considerate. And the reason was because they hadn't burned up all their energy at work before they got home. They still had energy when they saw their beloved. Okay, so now they know that willpower is like a muscle. It needs energy and it goes up and down depending on your energy level. Okay, so then they wanted to find out, well, where is it, right? And so they did some more experiments. What they did was they took a group of people and they wired them to EEGs. Okay, so you got the brain detectors all over you. And first, what they did is they put them in a theater and they showed them documentaries with animals who were suffering. But they told the people, you have to be stoic, no emotion. You cannot show any emotion, even though you're watching this thing. So they watch the animals suffer, but they make no emotional, sign. Then they brought these people into a room and they would show them flashcards. And on the flashcards, they were told, tell me the color of the letters that you see on these cards. But sometimes they would try and trick the person so that the green letters would spell out the word red. Well, when a person sees a flashcard that spells red, what you want to do is jump in and yell red, even though the letters are in green. So it takes self-control to say, I want to say red, but the right answer is green. So I'm going to say green. That takes self-control. What they discovered is that watching people go through that process of not going to say red, going to say green, lit up a certain portion of the brain. That portion, for all of you medical doctors, is called the anterior cingulate cortex, right? The anterior cingulate cortex, and it's located right next to the prefrontal cortex and the brainstem, which has the limbic system. So it's right in between, with a direct nerve channel that goes from the limbic system to the anterior cingulate cortex to the prefrontal cortex. Okay. Now, what's the primary job of that part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex? Unconsciously monitors conflicts in your brain. Okay. In other words, if you're walking down the street and you have a sandwich in one hand and a cell phone in another, that part of the brain tells you when you start lifting your phone up to take a bite, it's the part that says, oh no, don't bite your phone, bite the sandwich. That's the part of the brain. Don't do this, do that. Okay, so as you can see, it's a decider. It's a don't go this way, go that way, right? It also manages our emotions and it manages our actions, including impulse control. Okay, so in other words, the very thing we've been talking about willpower happens in that part of the brain. Okay. All right. Now, here's what else they found. Right here, here's another example. It has to do with that part of the brain and energy. It's called the dirty socks and college students experiment. So what they did is they got a bunch of college students and they did the experiment during finals week. Okay. Now, these students, the psychologists went in with an assumption. The assumption was the really straight A students would be really good at keeping their room neat and doing their laundry and eating a good diet, right? And in fact, that turned out to be true, except during finals week when it wasn't true. Okay. What they found was that during finals week, all those good habits went to the wayside. So these straight A students stopped exercising, stopped returning phone calls, stopped washing their dishes, brushing their teeth, washing their hair, shaving, washing their clothes, right? Hence the dirty socks. Now, you would assume, oh, they're just smart and savvy. That's how they get straight A's. They're saving their time and energy for focusing on studying. But it turns out that didn't turn out to be true either. In fact, they spent more time with their friends than they did studying. They slept more. They went on shopping sprees. They were grumpy, right? They were a mess, okay? And here's what they found, that these students who are normal straight A students had used up so much energy studying for finals that they lost all self-control. Okay, so whatever this thing called willpower is, that's in the anterior cingulate cortex, it goes up and down with energy. So then they asked this question: where does the power for the willpower come from? Right? And what they found was, this is my favorite part of the book, is that you can summarize the book in 4 words, right? Which is fantastic. And a whole book, 4 words. Here's the summary. Here's your thesis. No glucose, no willpower. Glucose, sugar, is what runs your willpower, right? The body processes just, unless it's a protein or a fat, the body processes just about everything else we eat into glucose, which is the energy that runs all the cells of the body, okay? Glucose. So, in other words, what they figured out was that part of the brain that is our impulse control, our self-control, our willpower, needs glucose, and it needs a lot of it. The reason is because glucose, even though it doesn't go into the brain, it feeds the neurotransmitters for all of our synapses, all of our brain movements and decisions and actions. They need neurotransmitters which need the glucose, okay? So, sure enough, they did some tests. They did one with breakfast and elementary school students. So, half of a group of elementary students were given a great breakfast. The other half got 0 food at all before school. Sure enough, the half who had nothing to eat couldn't learn and were behavior problems. Then, mid-morning, they gave everybody something to eat. Sure enough, the students turned up, could learn something, and were no longer behavior problems. Because why? They had glucose that helped their self-control, right? They also, just to reinforce the truth of this idea, it's true with dogs as well, with other animals, same thing. They had a test with dogs where half the dogs had to stay for 10 minutes. The other half didn't have to do anything at all for 10 minutes. Then they gave these dogs those Kong toys with peanut butter in the middle, or some kind of prize in the middle, and the dogs had to figure out how to get the good food out from the puzzle. Well, the dogs who were told to sit and stay lasted less than a minute with the puzzle. But the dogs who had nothing else to do lasted 10 minutes. Glucose, right? All right, so what does that mean? What have we learned so far from this book? What we've learned is that it's not true that human beings have no willpower. We do. And the scientists can even point to the part of the brain where it exists and works, right? But what determines how effective we are at using willpower or not, it's not our character. It's not our soul. It's not our spirit. It's how much glucose do you have in your body system, right? That's what determines it, okay? Now, where can you get glucose? Some of the experiments ended up giving people these huge sugary drinks. That's not really where you want to get your glucose. What you want to do, you want to have a healthy with complex carbohydrates. You want to get plenty of sleep because sleep helps you process glucose. And you want to get exercise because that keeps your glucose levels constant, right? So, in other words, these kinds of basic healthy habits can keep your glucose levels high, which give you more willpower. Okay. All right. So, Now, what else can help you in keeping that willpower high? Let's take a look at your goals you set. You remember that we're trying to move towards brokenness to wholeness. So you're going to be setting goals for yourself. Well, let's say that your goal is I want to improve my relationship with my spouse. Okay? I want to improve my relationship with my spouse. But let's say you have a second goal, and your second goal is I want to spend more time with my children. Well, the problem is that those goals, they may go together, but they might clash, right? Because time you're spending with your spouse probably should be maybe one-on-one. It's not time you're spending with your kids, focusing on them, and vice versa. Now, what that does is that's going to lower your willpower, because you're going to spend a lot of internal energy anxious about these clashing goals, right? Another example would be, I want to get a promotion at work. I want to get closer to my family. Those are going to clash most likely, because you're going to have to put in extra hours at work. You're not going to have the attention and the energy for your family, right? So one thing you can do is you pick realistic goals that don't clash, and you focus on those until you get them right. So for example, you could pick as your goals, I want to stop smoking and I want to save money. Guess what? Those two reinforce each other. It's killing two birds with one stone. That leaves you non-anxious, and you can put all your effort into those two goals and have energy to spare. Okay. All right. What else can you do? You can manage your schedule, your daily schedule. In other words, what you want to do is you want to pick, for you to address the most challenging changes in your life. You know, as Gerald May would say, if you want to stop an addiction, there are certain times of the day when you should attempt to do that, and other times when you should not. Okay. And it has to do with your glucose level. Okay. Let me give an example of how your daily schedule and glucose levels can affect things. And this is from a study they did of judges who were called to determine cases for parole for people in prison. Here's what they found. You know, the old joke amongst people in the law system is, if you want to know how a judge is going to rule, ask him what he ate for breakfast. That's the joke. But it turns out pretty much to be true. So let's say you're a person in prison, you've done the application for parole, and now you're coming before the judge. If you come before the judge early in the morning, you have a 70% chance of getting parole. If you come before that same judge late that afternoon, you have a 10% chance of getting parole. 70, 10. What's the difference? Early morning, judge just had breakfast, plenty of energy to make decisions. Late afternoon, it's been a while since lunch, expended a lot of energy making decisions, low on glucose, can't make a decision to save her or his life, so punts, says, we'll see you next year, right? Similarly, if you meet the judge before the mid-morning snack, 20% you'll get parole. After the mid-morning snack, 65% you'll get parole. I mean, these numbers are astounding. Meet the judge before lunch, 20%. After lunch, 60%. And the reason is because it takes a lot of willpower to make a decision about somebody's life. When your willpower is low, what you want to do is get out of that difficult decision making, and you basically want to procrastinate, which is what a denial for parole is. It's saying, We're not saying you'll never get it, but let's look at it next year. So what that means is deal with the toughest challenges when you're at your best, okay? Which tends to be mornings and after you've eaten something, okay? So in other words, you should plan your schedule to face your temptations when you're at your best, right? Okay, now, what else can you do? There are tactics you can use to make it more likely you'll succeed at making a change toward wholeness, or for example, stopping an addiction. One of them is called pre-commitment, right? This is where you lock yourself into the healthy path before you even try. And you do it by making yourself a disgrace, a laughingstock if you fail. Okay, so this is a person who basically makes an oath publicly and says, I'm going to, lose such and such amount of weight in however many months' time, right? There actually, by the way, are websites that are actually this very thing. You go to the website, make a public declaration to everyone else on the website about what you're going to do in terms of eating. Okay. What happens is making it public increases your likelihood to want to use your willpower. Okay. Here's something else you do. Another trick that has been learned. Have outside monitors who are monitoring your behaviors and choices. In other words, if somebody else knows that you want to make a change toward wholeness and they are monitoring your daily behavior, you're more likely to stick with the good behavior. Now, everyone in AA knows what this is. It's called a sponsor, right? So they learned early on that this technique helps to increase your success. Here's another interesting little trick, and this one is counterintuitive. Let's say you want to stop eating so much sugar, so much sweets, but you really like sweets, but you want to stop eating the sweets, okay? What you should never do is say to yourself, I'm never going to eat another sweet again. Or, let's say you love a certain kind of cake. I will never eat that cake again. If you say that, as Gerald May rightly said, you're guaranteed to eat that cake. Okay, no. So you do not say, I will not eat that cake ever. What you do is when an opportunity comes up, you've got that temptation, you say, I would like to eat the cake, but I don't think I'll eat the cake now. But maybe I'll eat it after dinner or, in 3 hours or tomorrow, right? You postpone that pleasure. Now, sometimes 3 hours later, you'll eat the cake. But more often than not, 3 hours come and what you say is, I don't really need the cake. And you don't eat the cake, right? And it's because you didn't force the hand of your willpower with that absolute never, ever, right? That takes a huge amount of willpower to resist. But the statement, maybe I'll get the cake in 3 hours, maybe not, that's not that much pressure, okay? Here's another trick. It's called these are psychological terms that they use. Implementation intention, right? But what this one is you basically get started on the good behavior early, okay? An example of this, let's say you're trying to start exercising regularly and you want to go to the gym like every morning before work. Well, what you do is you take your clothes for the workout and your tennis shoes and you set them out like right by your bed or in the bathroom or in front of the front door, but you set these clothes out. what that does, you're basically getting started early going to the gym. Okay. And what that does is it makes it easier because you have to use less willpower. Okay. All right. Now, so what we've learned is that there are techniques you can use to keep your glucose high and to not expend as much. But here's the biggest trick for not expending as much glucose every day. It's called habit, right? And, we're going to talk later next week about habit. But what they've learned is that habits, they can lead us into bad things like addiction, but they can also be our saviors. Because when you have good habits, it takes a lot less willpower to do the behaviors. When it just becomes rote, right? I mean, like brushing our teeth. We all brush our teeth. I think we probably brush our teeth at least twice a day, if not more. But you realize that 100, 150 years ago, nobody brushed their teeth. And dentists could not get people to brush their teeth ever. We learned a good habit. Makes it a whole lot easier. Okay. Habits use less glucose, which means you're saving it up for when you have a genuine temptation during your day. So healthy habits make it possible to do more healthy habits. It's like an upward spiral. So that the path toward wholeness means develop good early habits and then keep adding on to the good habits. That's how you make it pretty easy to get towards wholeness. Okay, so that's the Baumeister. Basically, they admit in the book, you know what? Some changes are hard to do. It takes willpower. We know it may take a while. But is it impossible? No. It is doable. It's doable because we have the anterior cingulate cortex, and it's like a muscle, and it runs on energy. And if you do things that keep your energy high, you'll have the willpower to make these changes. All right. Questions about Baumeister's theory or comments or thoughts about the juxtaposition between Gerald May, who says you're helpless before an addiction, you need God and grace, versus Baumeister, who says, no, we've got the resources in our brain and body to make changes.
All right, friends, if you got questions, go ahead and raise your digital hand, or you can do it on the screen as well, and I'll call you on you. It looks like Jane's got a question. Go ahead, Jane.
I was thinking, going back to the children, and in my mind kept thinking variables, variables, variables. These 4 children, as the cortex grows, there may have been some more mature at a particular stage than others, even though these people were tracked. And I assume the people that weren't as successful, maybe they wouldn't have been as successful anyway, because of their makeup, their maturity, whatever. So I was thinking maybe I would like to have seen a larger group. And now I go to the college people. They're in college, they're not dumb. I took one of those tests in college. Right away, I knew what they were doing. Do I go along, or do I say, I'm not doing this. I'm thinking of the radishes. Okay, now, hey, cookies, radishes, there's something going on here. And I think I would have played the game differently. That's all.
No, that's exactly right, Jane, is that whenever we move into the arena of science and their studies, particularly their statistical studies, their experiments, you get into the question of how objective and reliable are these studies, or do they have bias that we're not seeing, or maybe even the scientists themselves don't see? So you're correct. Luckily, most scientists, because of that peer review part of it, is that even if they're not looking at it when they get it peer reviewed, all the other competitors are saying, do we trust your studies? Did you do X, Y, and Z? But no, you're correct to ask those questions.
And one last one, if I may. talking about the cortex. At what stage does this begin to really develop? Because we all know little kids have tantrums. They don't have willpower when they're 1, 2 like that. It has to develop. Does that depend upon the cortex? Is it somehow learned through the parents? I assume it does. You have to wait. Yes, you can have the toy after blah blah blah. So that's developed. But does the cortex grow according to the growth of the person?
No, that's another great question. And as we know now, although I think this information now is only 20 years old, but neurologists and behavioral psychologists, they used to think that people became adults in their teenage years. Obviously, prior to the 20th century, people had adult responsibilities quite early. They could be 15 or 17 or 19. They were doing the work and the responsibilities and the family's things of an adult. What they now know, however, is that the brain is not finished growing and developing until you're like 25. So mid 20s, and the part of the brain in particular that is not finished developing, impulse control. It's why people in their teenage and college and early 20s, why they can make horrible decisions on the spur of the moment is because unlike later adults, the impulse control is not fully developed. Well, what's impulse control? The anterior cingulate cortex. So you're correct that part of the brain is not finished developing. What's interesting though, look at this very discussion we're having. We're talking about teenagers or young adults who aren't able to do self-control very well. We're talking about a portion of the brain and whether it's developed. That's what Baumeister has given us, because prior generations, including in the church, what we would have been talking about? Their character, whether they had good character or poor character, right? Were they good children or bad children? We would have been talking about their spirit, as if their will floated in their soul or their spirit. That's not how you and I are talking right now. We're talking about brains and synapses. That's a big shift.
Last thing, I think teenagers, young children do not have the concept of cause and effect. They don't think that far ahead. That's all.
Other comments, questions?
All right. I think I saw Alan Dunham first, and then I saw Walt second, and then Jim Rolka third.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Every morning I take pills for my heart, for my thyroid, vitamins, blood pressure. And I just wonder, as I start my day, where is this going? And then in the afternoon, I have a lunch, and you say it gives you energy. To me, it takes energy to digest. And so my afternoon candy is Excedrin, and it has caffeine in it and aspirin, and the aspirin kind of kills the aches and pains that I always carry around with me. So caffeine, maybe Adam can relate to this because he says he likes coffee. Anyway, thank you.
I know that, sometimes we can relate to it when we just say we're tired or we feel tired. The anterior cingulate cortex also does decision making. And you know how when you've worked hard all day and you get home and somebody in the family brings a problem, there's something wrong with the house that has to be fixed and it's going to cost money, or the children have a dilemma and they come to you and you need to make a decision. And what you end up feeling is, I can't make this decision now. I'm tired, right? Let me make it later in the evening or in the morning, right? That's actually a biochemical response. You are tired, which means you don't have glucose in that part of the brain that is able to make decisions, right? And so that's what Baumeister is talking about is, we can get these waves of glucose level in our bloodstream during the day. That can make it difficult to do self-control when we're on a trough. And so the idea is you're better off having a constant level of glucose throughout your day. And so.
All right. And Walt, you're next.
Okay, Greg, thank you. The glucose brain operation description is quite interesting. I can see that at work in myself. I can tell naturally that if I haven't had enough to eat at the right time, the brain doesn't function very well. And I'm certainly not motivated to make it work well. One high-level observation and a small tactical observation, and actually a question I should start with is, does Baumeister or any other authors you're thinking of looking at for this class go into the endocrinology of addiction? In other words, the hormones that get released when we do something that might be bad for us, but it makes us feel good or stimulates our brains in some ways?
Yes. What part of what self-control means, or impulse control, is the ability to both to delay gratification and to substitute a short-term hit for a long-term positive. And because oftentimes the long-term positive is much more healthy and valuable, but you have to be willing to forego something now and to wait. And so it is related to chemicals, because there's a part of our body and a part of our brain that is wired to take the short-term gain, right? And it's because if you don't take, it's the whole thing of the bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. If you don't take the bird in the hand right now, you may not get anything at all. So there's a good part of us that says, take the bird. That's why we can so easily get attached to things, particularly if they give us a quick hit. We can get addicted because a good portion of us is wired toward that. The thing that redirects us away from it towards long-term goals, willpower. So that's why we need that willpower, is it's able to use our reasoning to say, that looks good right now, but it's not going to look so good in 2 weeks' time. So willpower.
Okay, thank you. And the other comment I wanted to make was, it's my observation, both with myself and with some friends that have had addiction issues, is that a spiritual approach and a willpower approach have to work in concert, and they kind of have to feed off each other and reinforce each other.
Certainly. And that, that definitely was Gerald May's viewpoint. And also that's AA. So absolutely, you take out the spiritual piece, the willpower is not going to work, right? That's not what Baumeister says. But of course, Baumeister and his colleagues, they're atheists. So they don't believe in a spiritual dimension. So they look at it without the spiritual, but what they end up saying is, of course you can make changes because you have the wherewithal within your whole bodily system. So what I'm saying is we've got a tension or a disagreement.
Okay, yes, that's what I have observed, that tension in many venues. Anyway, the other is a tactical comment, which is one of the strategies you mentioned was monitoring, having an outside monitor. For myself, I have observed that being a fastidious keeper of a journal is a way to self-monitor. Just writing things down and seeing, did I do a certain behavior or not over the course of a day or a week or whatever the time frame is as good as having to go and talk to somebody else about it that's going to wag their finger at me.
No, you're exactly right, and that is one of the techniques they do mention, but I didn't have time to bring it up. But you can create a monitor, a self-monitor. But the trick, you're exactly right. The trick is write it down, and write it down in a place where you're going to see it and it's obvious, right? So yes, that is a technique that helps.
Yeah, I mean, pardon my English, but I find that if you write out something in sentences like that, that it's a lot harder to, be in denial and ignore your BS.
Yep.
All right, we're going to go to Jim Rolka because I saw him first, then Art, then Bill, and then Audrey.
So earlier on, you were talking about the correlation between self-esteem and success. And I always consider self-esteem to be very much more closely allied to your emotional state. The emotions that perhaps interactions with other people have left upon you, or world events have left upon you, and so forth. And so how does that tie into this whole glucose and, because it's
yeah, no, that's a great question. And what we found is that Baumeister, who started his career looking at self-esteem and happiness, changed his tune, and now he believes if you want to be happy, you need self-control, you need willpower. The willpower enables you to achieve your goals. And when you actually achieve things you set out to do, you will naturally feel better about yourself. Your self-esteem will rise because of the actual accomplishments you've achieved, right? Which were based in willpower. So that's how he connects it to self-esteem. But what he says is that any kind of supposed improvement in self-esteem that's not connected to actual behaviors and achievements is ephemeral. It's too superficial. So this guy is totally, he really believes in willpower.
All right, and Art.
Yes, Greg, I agree with the glucose description that you've provided. However, I have the opposite problem here. If I have a lunch or a dinner and I sit down to work at the computer, I am useless. I just do not have the brain power to. However, if I say, well, let me go down and straighten out the garage or something like that, doing something physical to keep me awake works. But there's this time after, obviously you're digesting a meal, blood's going to the gut and not to the brain here. I'm not totally sure how to deal with that, but that's got something to do with the lack of energy.
Yep. No, that's helpful, Art, in that what it reveals again is that you are noticing things about your energy level as it goes up and down through the day. So it fluctuates, and it can be connected to eating, to food intake. I know that sometimes I've heard that nutritionists and doctors will say that this whole system of 3 meals a day that Americans have, we basically developed it in the 19th century when it came to farming. But 3 meals, relatively big meals a day, what they say is that's not actually ideal. So maybe you've heard this said before, but some nutritionists say have 6 small meals a day, 6 times you eat, spread out maybe 3 hours a piece. But they're not big meals, they're little, but you're eating more consistently through the day, which they say that mimics more closely what we would have how we would have eaten in ancient times. And so that's one technique. The idea is you want to keep the glucose level as constant as you can.
Yeah. One other comment about habits. One thing I detest doing is brushing my teeth before going to bed at night. I am tired and just want to go to bed. So I figured a way to take care of it. Actually, to the point where sometimes I said, the heck with it, I'm just going to bed. Supporting the dentist here. However, if I turn the 10 o'clock news on, I can floss and brush and do all of that while I'm watching the news, and it's no problem. So I've essentially found a habit that's joined with something else to make it happen, and to lower the dental bills as well.
And that's we're going to look at that next week. We're going to look some more at this, but notice what happened is that what you did is you took a situation where previously it was just you and the toothbrush. You're staring at a toothbrush and you're having to say to yourself, I need to brush my teeth, but I don't want to, but I should because it's good, right? Which means that it's like 100% willpower, right? Right? Which then you change the situation so you added a distraction and a pleasurable element. Let's say I'm going to do this, and while I'm doing it, I'll also brush my teeth, right? And so that's not me and the brush, my willpower, 100%. And so what happens is that what they've discovered is the most difficult human situation there is. It's when it's you and the temptation and nothing else in the room. When it's 100% willpower, humans almost always lose. We can't do it, not for very long, maybe for a little bit, but if it's too long, we'll lose. And so somehow you have to create situations where it's not 100% willpower to do this job. Habit is one of them. Distractions are another. There are techniques you can use. But that's what's so interesting, is this idea that willpower exists and we can actually do things to increase it, right? That's interesting.
All right. And sorry about that. It looks like Bill Bradfield, then Audrey, then Tally.
All right. I have a couple of comments or a couple of questions. The first one has to do with an observation. Addiction. A person with an addiction problem gets labeled, and they must have been hardwired towards this, predisposed. But I think when you say something like that, you are denying your own addictive behavior, your own addictive pre-wiring. And so that's my comment. My question has to do with set the setting. I'm now 26 years old. My brain is fully developed. I'm ready to move towards wholeness, although I'm probably not thinking about that. I'm labeling it something else that really isn't wholeness. But as you get older, the body changes, the chemistry changes, structurally we change, gravity has this effect. Have there been any studies about aging and its impact on our ability to successfully move towards wholeness?
Absolutely. Because think about it. The old view, which is 3,000 years old in the West, includes the Greek philosophy, but also the Jewish and Christian Muslim traditions, right? The old view was that the will was real, but it was lodged in the soul or the human spirit or the heart, but it was lodged in something that was non-body. It was spiritual, right? And so in that situation, As you got older, your soul is the same, your spirit's the same, your character is developed. You should have the same amount of willpower or self-control that you had in your 20s and 40s, right? If you're using that model. If you're using this model, however, willpower is actually a part of the body. It's located in a portion of the brain. The brain needs glucose to run. You know what else it needs? Cells and neurotransmitters. But what happens is that when the body ages, so does the brain, and you lose cells everywhere in your body, but your brain included. You have fewer cells in that anterior cingulate cortex than you did when you were 20 or 40. What that means, fewer cells plus not as effective neurotransmission, that means it doesn't work as well, which means you have lowered impulse control, right? So the older you get, the lower your impulse control, simply biologically and neurologically. So in other words, we shouldn't be blaming people as if they have poor character, when in fact, this is a neurological and biochemical situation. That's what this particular book would mean.
Boy, that makes it sound like the journey towards wholeness is if you're older than 55, good luck.
Exactly. That's what makes this so interesting. However, there are also advantages that go when you're older in terms of that journey. Again, a great example of this is a book I've already mentioned by David Brooks called The Second Mountain, right? Yeah. He basically says, no, you actually make most of your progress towards wholeness after your 40s, right? And that's what many of the world's religions say as well. If you actually want to become whole, you have to get past these young and middle adult years to do it. So there are advantages also that go with our increasing age. But I also wanted to comment on your question about whether somebody can have a predisposition to addiction, right? Maybe you've heard in the newspaper something called the genetic predisposition to addiction. And my studies show that the school's still out on whether that's true or not. There have been some studies that show altered genes or missing genes related to a connection to alcohol, for example, and some other substances. That would say, yeah, genetic predisposition. But some of the other scientists, including those who work with addicts and willpower, say, no, we're all pretty much at the same level. So there's a disagreement.
All right, and Audrey. You'll have to unmute yourself. You got it.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, you got it.
Okay, great. Oh, all right. So there's been a lot of information. Thank you. So I'm going to digress to last week on addiction. So is there anything like a group addiction? Because for one person who likes another person who's just as addicted, but then that one person wants to change, and then suddenly there's a loss because the other person's not changing. So is there a way to make the group change at the same time so nobody feels left out?
No, that's a great question. And so the two thoughts that I have, first of all, another technique that helps you make these changes is don't try and do it alone. Do it with other people. It's easier if you have people who are trying to make the same change as you. They've done studies, for example, with either increasing weight if you need that or decreasing weight if you need that. Basically, what they found is that birds of a feather flock together. If you're with other people who want to make the same change, you're all going to be more likely to do it. If you actually associate with people who don't want to make the change you want to make, it's a lot harder for you. So in that sense, yes, you do want to connect yourself with groups who want to make the same change because it's easier. And in terms of, whether there are laws or whether you can make laws, societies do that, but also so do children and teenagers. You know how children can, teenagers, they can have these rules that are in flux. Well, what happens is one member of a group says, hey, I want to make this change. And then maybe the rest say, okay, well, I'll do it. Here's our new rule. And pretty soon you have a new rule for the whole group that helps everybody make a change. But society does that as well. After all, we have a law that says you have to wear a seatbelt. Finally put that law into effect because just saying, hey, it's a good idea to wear a seatbelt wasn't making the change. So,
Okay.
All right, and Tally.
I always share about self-esteem. I'm a teacher, and they sent us one year over to Oakland to a conference to talk about self-esteem for the students that we had in class. And this one person got up and said, I think you've got the idea of self-esteem all wrong. You're trying to raise the self-esteem of your students who are coming over from Richmond. And you're trying to give them self-esteem without realizing that you can't give them self-esteem because they get their self-esteem in. And they all have very high self-esteem. They get it because they're failing their classes, and the group with which they live considers that very high and giving them self-esteem. They've all got guns and they get their self-esteem there. And you bring them over to Marin County and say, I'm going to give you self-esteem. I can't, because they're very high on self-esteem, but they're not getting it from the same place that I think, or we thought we should be able to give it to them. And that changed my whole attitude towards many of my students when they all had high self-esteem. It just wasn't from where I was trying to give it to them.
No, that's very helpful, Tally, and it connects to what we were just talking about with Audrey, that and what we looked at 2 weeks ago, which is that wholeness, you have to have a definition of what that means. And we're also group and social animals. So the idea that we can make these changes simply by ourselves without thinking about our relational groups and contexts, that's not true. You have to think about your groups of people and what's going on in those groups and how you relate to those people. So you're correct that whatever this journey is towards wholeness, it's got several moving pieces, not just me and my willpower. More is going on.
Great. This has been a great conversation so far, guys. Are there any more questions, comments before Greg fills us in what's going to happen next week? Bill.
Two things. First of all, your comment about the 6 meals a day. I've also heard when people that are talking about altering life, I think taking naps, the importance of naps, and how that gives you a little sleep boost, a little 10-minute power nap, they call them, I guess. And the other thing, just to counter what I brought up earlier, there are advantages to getting older because when you retire, you have a chance to have more control over what you eat. You have a chance to get more sleep. You have, what are the other things that you talked about? But it is a chance to kind of rewrite your life. And and get exercise and get more exercise. And so they talk about a healthy retirement. I think you can really notice the difference in retirees, those that are enjoying a retirement full of these healthy things that you propose, advocate, and those that don't, and the couch potatoes, et cetera, stuff like that.
Absolutely. You have the opportunity when you've retired to use the best part of your day in terms of your energy, your focus on things that help you have a healthier life and have that wholeness, right? Prior to that, many people, when they're working, particularly if you've got two people working in a household, you're trying to raise a family, that's difficult because in some ways, the best part of your day in terms of energy has to be expended at work. So retirement can be a boon.
All right. Any other questions, comments?
Okay, let me tell you where we're going next week. We have 2 more classes. And next week, what we're going to do is we're going to look further at what can enable us to use our resources to move towards wholeness. So this is going to connect to what we looked at this week, but also pull in some of the Gerald May from last week. But what we're going to look at is the power of habit, which I mentioned here earlier. And I mentioned the book by the Heath brothers on habit. There's also a book by Charles Duhigg called simply Habit. But these are scientists who have discovered how developing these by nature, the human animal develops habits. So the idea is to channel our natural habit making ability towards feeding the whole behaviors that we want, these positive, good behaviors. So how that can happen and how we can best use our abilities to get us there. Because as we also know, we can develop bad habits, and those are very hard to break and change. So come back next week, and we're going to learn more about how we can grab God's hand and move towards the wholeness that God seeks for us.
All right. And Tally, you put your hand up. Tally, did you have another comment?
I just wanted to say thank you very much for holding class tonight to get me out of watching TV. I really appreciated it.
Yep, this is life affirming, and the election can be a nerve-wracking and painful to watch. Yep.
Thank you, Greg.
You're welcome. Okay, I'll see you all next week. God bless.